No, she can come around and come out into the room. Good morning. Thank you for being here this morning for this announcement of legislation to enact or authorize a limited Pennsylvania constitutional convention to fix our broken state government. I'm State Representative Stephen Bloom. I'm on stage here with the Senate sponsor of identical legislation, Senator John Eichelberger, and also Senator Stefano, Senator White, and Representative McGinnis. Several of the co-sponsors. There are 23 House co-sponsors, actually a bipartisan list of co-sponsors, and I understand that in the Senate there's also a bipartisan list of co-sponsors for the legislation. Pennsylvania citizens are rightfully frustrated with our broken state government and have demanded some of the same major reforms for year after year, and yet the legislature has, for the most part, failed to adopt those. We look at the situation we face with our frustrating state budget. We look at the issue of property tax reform, things that have never gotten done. And this idea of a limited constitutional convention would open up the possibility that the citizens themselves could make these long overdue changes. The process, just in a quick nutshell, would be that if this bill would pass and be enacted, it would then go to the voters of Pennsylvania to, by referendum, decide yes or no to have this limited constitutional convention. Then at the convention, delegates would be elected. They would attend a convention. They would make the reforms they saw fit strictly on the items that are enumerated in the legislation, so it doesn't open up the whole Constitution, just areas that are ripe for reform. And then at the end of the entire process, once any reforms are enacted, the people of Pennsylvania get one final right to say yes or no, to approve or disapprove by another referendum. So there's safeguards built in to make sure that the changes enacted are ones that the people of Pennsylvania support. Some possibilities of what the voters, what the individuals who are elected as delegates to the convention could do. They could choose to reduce the size of the legislature, make it part-time. They could make changes to the pay, the per diems, and the travel reimbursements of members of the legislature. They could more precisely guide the redistricting process. They could add checks and balances on what the governor can or can't do in terms of spending in the event of a budget impasse. They could add additional transparency to the procurement process to prohibit or eliminate the possibility of no-bid contracts and other contracts where taxpayer dollars are wasted. They could change or eliminate the role of lieutenant governor in Pennsylvania. Most states don't have a lieutenant governor. That's something they could do if they saw fit. They could update the ethics and transparency requirements for representatives and members of the judiciary, amongst other changes. This hasn't happened. We haven't had a limited constitution convention since 1967, and so it's been 50 years, and I would certainly submit that it is time for us to make some of these fixes that the legislature itself seems incapable of making. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Senator Eichelberger for comments he may have, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Steve. I just follow up on a couple points. If people are satisfied with the direction of government today and they think that the common sense standards that they would hold for their businesses and their families are applicable in our state government, then they wouldn't be interested in this bill. But if they think that we're falling behind, that we're not making the decisions in a timely manner, that we're not following common sense procedures and standards, then I think they would support having a look at the Constitution today. As Steve said, it's been 50 years. We've done a number of these since the Commonwealth was established, and it's time to do it now. Everywhere we go, we hear questions from people about the size of the legislature, about the judiciary that seems to be, in many ways, acting as a legislature. The fact that they wouldn't turn back the pay raise whenever that happened, that they are operating independently of anybody else and any checks and balances in the system. We see budget impasses where the governor is making decisions along with state row officers to determine what bills he should pay, what he considers to be priority payments, what he doesn't. We see no checks and balances in that process. We see constitutional issues that I've just been involved with the Secretary of Education. The Constitution, even though the Constitution says that the General Assembly shall provide for a system of public education, that the Secretary of Education unilaterally submitted a plan for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to the federal government without any input from the legislature or any approval from the legislature. I think that's clear in the Constitution, but it doesn't operate that way. We see constitutional officers being appointed through the confirmation process that's addressed in the Constitution that, they need the advice and consent of the Senate. If we don't give it to them, the governor can leave those individuals, secretaries, cabinet members, other folks, in place in acting roles without any confirmation of the Senate. I'm sure that's not what the framers intended whenever they wrote the words in this 1968 version of our Constitution. These are all matters that we hear about regularly from people and matters that we understand a little more clearly from the inside working in the General Assembly. So this Constitutional Convention, very limited, only addresses Articles 2 through 5, which is the General Assembly, the legislation work of the General Assembly, the judiciary, and the executive branch. So people's individual rights, protected primarily in Article 1, would not be affected and could not be affected in this limited Constitutional Convention. One of the things that we often hear about is, aren't you afraid of a runaway convention, so that people might come in and introduce, the big issue I hear about is gun control measures. That cannot happen in this. There's protections built in. Constitutional law scholars have formulas, have procedures in place that we would use so that people would be removed from their position as delegate if they stray from the sections that are listed in the resolution that would be passed by the public. So no one can introduce anything beyond what is specifically addressed in the resolution. So I think this is a good step now. I'm hearing from people on both sides of the aisle. We have 10 co-sponsors in the Senate. 3 of them are Democrats. We have a lot of support. We've had 4 newspapers already come out supporting the concept of moving forward with this. And a number of groups, nonprofit groups, have had discussions with me, probably with Representative Bloom as well, looking to see what they could do to get involved, where we're going to go. And they're from all over the political spectrum. So people of all persuasions are interested in trying to make Pennsylvania a place where we can depend on our government, and we know that we can get things done in a fair manner and in a timely fashion. So that's what we're attempting to do by taking a fresh look at the Constitution. And I would just emphasize in closing that the way it works is we're following, of course, the current Constitution, the guidelines there. There would be 150 delegates that would run. They would run in every 3 delegates per Senate district. So with the 50 Senate districts, 3 of those folks would run. They could not be the legislators themselves. They would be citizens from those areas. And then there would be the officers of the House and Senate and the lieutenant governor. There would be 13 of those people total, and they would be ex officio members. So it would be a total of 163 delegates at the convention. So we're open for questions, and I appreciate the support of some of the co-sponsors that came today.
Jim?
How much has this budget impasse kind of driven home the idea that we need to take this step?
Certainly for me and Senator Eichelberger, we've been talking about this idea since the previous legislative session, but I think the frustration has mounted, and certainly the budget impasse and some of the factors that led to it are part of the impetus for this. One of the things that disturbs me is that when there are questions about what the actual enacted budget allows for, that the governor has so much discretion, or at least has chosen to exercise discretion on what money gets spent and what doesn't, which is really a legislative role, but yet the governor has chosen to do that, and the Constitution isn't clear enough, in my opinion, in restricting the governor when there's a situation where either there's a budget impasse or there is some sort of a budget shortfall. I think the Constitution, in my opinion, should absolutely require him to set aside sufficient reserves so we never get into short-term deficit situation like he has allowed to happen over the last year and a half.
I just added, I think that's a shining example of one of the fixes that we could have with, through a convention. They could address that and clean up all these related issues surrounding a budget impasse, and make it very difficult for a budget impasse to happen. Put some things in place, some penalties in place that might really virtually prohibit it. Stoppage of pay, things like that. Those things can all be addressed. It's up to the citizen delegates that would be elected to the convention.
Can you explain what the timeframe would be, and again, what the process overall is?
People would go through to be elected delegate. Well, we would have to pass this, as Representative Bloom said, and then it would go to the ballot for the public to approve it. And then if it's approved, there would be an election process similar to every other election process, although the delegates do not run with party affiliation. So they would have to do a nominating petition. They would have to file that with the Commonwealth, and they would have to pay a nominal fee. I think it's $20 or $25 we have in legislation for the filing fee. And they would act just like pretty much any other candidate. They would run for office. So their timelines are based, and I can't tell you exactly. It's in the legislation, but based on when everything would, of course, depend on when this was passed and when it was on the ballot. And then from there, timeframes would be in place to walk you through when the delegates would be elected and then when they would serve. And they would serve for a brief period, and I can't remember what it says in the bill. Do you remember, Steve?
Yeah, it's a period of months, so it's not.
It's a few months. There'd be an allocation for them to be here. They would not be paid. They would receive expenses. They would be provided some staff, some expertise. We would have some attorneys and technical people on staff for them. And we would also have, as part of this, a fund established through the Commonwealth that people could contribute to. I know that I've already talked to one group that would be interested in contributing to sponsoring, at least in part, the convention. So could end up that there may not even be any tax dollars involved. But a lot of people in Pennsylvania are interested in seeing this move forward, and they're willing to help. Some of the businesses are willing to help in that respect as well. Do you have it in there?
Well, now, I'm just going to say one of the things that I wished I would have mentioned earlier, no member of the General Assembly would be eligible to serve as a delegate.
Right. I mentioned that.
Oh, you did? Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay.
That's positive as far as you're concerned, to have the politics kind of out of it.
Exactly.
Yeah. This would be a citizen group that would come together to address the issues as they see fit.
Have you guys put a price tag on what this may cost from beginning to end? Because I mean, are there going to have to be special elections at either, or are they going to, or is it going to depend on like the election cycle as far as when people will vote on it, stuff like that?
It would depend on the election cycle, so there wouldn't really be a lot of costs associated with that. The conference itself, the initial allocation would be $200,000. There would be a committee established. Once it's passed by the voters, there would be a committee established to design the whole process and make sure that everything works. And there would be an allocation for them for $200,000 to get that, to get everything moving. And then, as I say, the other conference would only take a few months, and I anticipate getting a substantial amount of that money from
And
citizens. that
there's
would donate it.
there's a fixed point at which the whole thing, it's sine die is the word they use, but that we use in the legislation, but the whole thing ends. So it has no more power then after it expires.
And time frame wise, I mean, I know you said it depends on when it gets passed, the election cycle, but in a perfect world, what do you hope? Time frame wise, how long this would take from beginning to end?
Well, ideally, at this point, if it moves swiftly, if the legislation moves swiftly, it could be on the ballot in the spring election cycle in 2018, and then the process would unfold from there.
And then the actual convention itself, how long have you guys allocated for that?
It would occur then after that election, it would occur during that year. And the dates are relative to the election cycle, so there's a window that would open, and then it would have to be closed in time for the actual findings of the convention to be voted on by the public.
It would commence on July 1st at 12 o'clock noon, depending on the year that it was established, and it would end no later. It says, the Constitutional Convention shall conclude its session sine die not later than November 1. So that would be the maximum
So there's
timeframe.
that window there.
Is leadership on board with this idea? Because we've seen leaders over the years, some of them support some of these ideas that you say could be addressed, and then some not so fond of it. So do you think you could even get this to a vote?
I'll tell you, I mean, the thing that is going to drive this to the point where it actually gets voted is going to be citizens calling their representatives and their senators and asking them to do this. That's why we're having a public press conference today. That's why we'll be talking about this in multiple public venues over the months to come. And as folks get on board, again, as we mentioned, there's a number of major newspapers have already come out in favor of this, from newspapers with both conservative bent and more liberal bent as well. We have different advocacy groups that have shown interest, good government advocacy groups, again, on a bipartisan basis. So our hope is that there becomes enough pressure from the citizens on their own representatives and senators to see this thing done, that will be what moves our leadership to allow it to come to a vote and then go to the people for a vote.
And I haven't had any formal conversations with my leadership, although I have had one of the leadership team approach me and tell me that he's interested in becoming involved.
Can you tell which one?
I'd sooner not speak for any of them, but it was one of our top people.
In your caucus?
Yes. And I think, I mean, I anticipate that we will not have issues with leadership. I'd like to see the governor get on board too. I haven't had a chance to speak with him or his staff, but I would hope that he would be willing to take a look at this, and hopefully he'll be supportive. Again, it should be a bipartisan issue, and we could all work together to bring out issues, flush out issues that we think need to be addressed. I mean, they've confessed in the budget delays we've had that it's difficult for them to determine where they are and what authority they have and so on. So I think they understand the issues very well, that a few of those issues that we've discussed this morning that should be addressed.
If reducing the size of the legislature is one of the topics, do you feel like that might be a sticking point for some of the members?
I don't think. I mean, the House has brought that.
We've passed it.
Before.
We've passed it in several successive sessions in the House, and I've voted for it and co-sponsored it. I don't know that that's going to be again, if the citizens want it and make their voices heard, that's going to be something that could be on the table. And another point also I had wanted to make is that this document now that we're introducing is probably not going to be the exact final version of it. We're open to hearing ideas from the public and from our colleagues. I mean, I've already had a colleague approach me on the House floor yesterday with some ideas, some things that weren't in the draft I thought of that he was suggesting. And I said, we're going to be open to constructive amendments that would make this a better bill as we move forward before it actually gets voted on. And I think there will be a discussion taking place over the coming months now that we're to the point of having all the legislative language drafted and ready to go.
And I would clarify that further by saying that we're still restricting it to the articles. But
Yes.
what we do in the bill is we refine it even further to sections in those articles. And I think Steve and I both had a conversation this morning that we'd like to include some other sections that are not currently in the drafts we have. In fact, the Senate bill was introduced yesterday. The House bill has not been, so we may even refine the House bill a little bit more and prepare amendment ready for our bill in the Senate.
Have you spoken to the judiciary at all? Because that's an interesting branch.
Yeah, I've not had any specific discussions with the judiciary branch on the legislation.
Any ideas that you have that you'd like to see a convention tackle with regard to the judiciary?
I mean, we've seen time after time good legislation that has gone through the General Assembly, been signed by the governor, and then the courts have really stripped it of its intended purpose. That's been frustrating. There's been issues in some cases with scandals involving members of the judiciary, just like there have been scandals involving members of the legislature. I'd like to see further accountability, making sure that taxpayers know that there's not self-interest at work.
Well, and the numbers of the members of the judiciary, too, magisterial district judges, common pleas court judges, all those things, I think that's an issue that we struggle with every year. We go through that question and answer period every year at the appropriations hearings. We get some answers, they're working on it, they're doing a study, all these kinds of things, and they're a very expensive branch of government, just like each branch is, and we think that there should be some efficiencies there as well. How they operate, all those things, the structure and operation of the three branches of government, that's what this convention would be about.
Okay. Thank you, folks.
Yeah, thank you
Appreciate
very
it.
much.